I was reading something on the internet, but anyway, it's called the apistat. The apistat, it's in the hypothalamus in the brain. But the reason, and this is where we control the food. You know how many times I mentioned about the thermostat? Well, the direct name, actually, I guess the scientific name may be apistat in the hypothalamus. But anyway, I always said that the body, and I see this in people who eat normally, have a perfect thermostat you could keep within 1 or 2 pounds. But the problem is, one of the problems is, we always talk about our thinking, which I guess is the main thing, because if as it says in the big book, if we get our thinking straight, then everything else will fall into place. If we have that spirituality, the mind and the body will be fine. But anyway, so just to read a little bit, but I also talked about the bliss point with that psychologist. They do research. Not only the scientists are there doing the research, but they have psychologists. And the psychologists figured out what they call a bliss point in the brain. So actually, scientifically, it's this thing called the apistat in the hypothalamus. But the crazy thing is when I was reading further and all the research and everything I knew already about what happens to this thermostat, that all the scientists, they put in sucrose, fructose, SOS we always talked about, salt, oil, and sugar. And with all of these chemicals, the 50 chemicals I always talk about, go into your brain. Actually, I have a list here. They're called the artificial sweeteners, or some of them, saccharin, aspartame. We have a high fructose corn syrup. Well, what it seems like, if you want the scientific explanation about what these big corporations do to us, is that they figure out what goes into the brain, and what it does is it ruins your ability for your apistat to work in your hypothalamus. So here you are, it's these chemicals they figured out will go in there, and what it does, it numbs it down with all of these high intensity synthetic sugars and all this hydrogenated and oils and everything, and all it overloads the brain, so the brain doesn't know anymore. So here we got a reason why people say, well, how come today people are so crazy with the food? Well, one of the reasons is because we're putting these chemicals into our body. We were just talking before about, eating wholesome, natural food. Like, I always bring up the fruit and the apples, the oranges, and so I brought potato. Like I always say, maybe next time we'll get crazy and bring some broccoli and carrots. I'll tell you, when you're off of those synthetic sugars and when you're off of that thing the corporations feed you, everything tastes good. It's God's gift. It really is amazing, especially, come on, fruit or all of these things. And a lot of people, again, when I bring this up, they talk about high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, high protein. And I'm saying to you, it's not so much as we eat, but it's what we put on the food. So just think about that. Something could be like they're saying here, all of these synthetic things they put on the foods and a tremendous amount of calories. So understand, look, we always have to know where the problem is. A lot of times, it's a spiritual program. We talk about the 12 steps. The problem is our thinking. But also we have to understand what we're up against, and that we're up against these corporations to do it for the money. But it's, again, we make the decision again. And it says in the big book, when the mental obsession, when the thinking is straightened out, then the allergy of the body doesn't come into play. It's academic. It says that because what happens is we'll intuitively know the answer to our problem. So here, through intuition will tell you, do you want all those poisons into your body? But the problem is, I have another topic here, is that it's not so much the binging we do with food or how we handle, whether some people are anorexic or, bulimic, whatever it is obsession towards the food. It's not so much the obsession, but it's the way we handle when we have those moments. And what we do is we get into the self, and I also have another reading here about the self. We get self-recrimination, guilt, shame, remorse. We get paralyzed by fear. Then we can't even, our stomach tightens up, right? The solar plexus. When you feel the fear, then we can't even feel when we're full. If you eat too much food, feel the feeling of, you can feel it. But when you're in fear, you can't. And then realize your stomach, look, the body knows perfectly how to handle the food. So when we get centered, we relax, you'll feel your body feeling full. But what you want to do when you get into that, you could rechange your thinking where you want to feel lean and clean, eat healthy foods, have that empty feeling sometimes. Think about that glorious feeling, right? Not being into the materialist of the food. How come so many religions and philosophies, they fast? Because they know they have these spiritual experiences and the happiness, joy, and bliss when they're not putting their mind on something material. We always talk about it could be food, but it could also be money, success, other people. So we get centered when we're into the self, and we get self-centered with self, then we have the problem. We get paralyzed by fear. And somebody said before the meeting, if you resist something, it becomes stronger. So we have to understand, when we get this God consciousness in, and we can relate it to the food, definitely towards the food and the steps in this program. So anyway, that has to do with the whole being centered. And we can, when you came into the lobby, I had start the day over. So we can always start the day over. In other words, no matter how much you're into your addiction or how much resentment you had, isn't it beautiful to say that, well, now I could just, and read something in our literature, or just have that thought that it's not about the self, it's about this higher consciousness, and we get out of self. Then we can let in, well, that reading I had here, but I'm just explaining anyway, had about that bliss and consciousness, which we were created. It's always been in here all the time. So in relation to the food, it's the same thing. We can find the joy and happiness, not in what the corporations, I just reading here, how they, scientists and the psychologists, and now this apistat, the center in the hypothalamus, they put these chemicals in, and they numb down. They numb down that hunger, the pain feeling that you have, so you don't even realize it anymore. But also another thing that numbs it down is our thinking, when we're in self-centered fear. When we get centered and we want what God's given, we want God's, clarity through water. This alone, and I always say this, in this meeting alone, if you can get this into yourself, that you don't want all of these 1,000-calorie drinks of 500 calories, how many they are, but the clarity of water. It's the change of perception. Look, our perception was changed by the commercials on the TV and the high corporations. Years ago, people weren't as indulgent as we were, and gluttonous, right? Gluttonous with the food. So what I'm saying here is that you could change your perception. It's perception change. Everything in life is, right? It's our perception of life that's 95% of the problem. When I get centered and pray or meditate or whatever it is, and I'm thinking about a problem, by the time I'm done, I realize I have no problems. The problem was in the way I reacted to life and what was in my mind. Directly related to our addictions, alcohol, drugs, food, whatever it is. Again, the ego has a great idea. This big plate of food, that's my higher power. That's my God. So we're so finite, and we get into the self, and the self is full of self-doubt, self-fear, selfishness, self-centeredness, and we wonder why we're miserable, because we took, we blocked out the sunlight of spirit through our addiction, through our thinking, worry, being upset, and it all has to do with the self.